So I think at this point on the channel, I have gone to great lengths to try to explain that Zoroastrianism is at its core not monotheistic. I know that that's very popular on the internet to say it's the first, and it's got a great ring to it as well. I know that it's the first and oldest form of monotheism and that it deeply influenced Judaism and Christianity and Islam, except probably there's not much or any truth to any of that. Maybe it did have some slight modern influence on ancient Judaism. That's, debated. But also kind of, I would say, as far as authenticity's sake goes, irrelevant. As far as, like, say, being the oldest form of monotheism, nah. And again, good academic data on this. From the very beginning, Zoroastrianism, we talk about, like, the reforms of Zarathustra. It doesn't appear in the Gathas at all that he has monotheism in mind, or even monolatrism, right? This idea that other gods exist, but we only worship really one. No, that doesn't seem to be there either. There are various gods mentioned or alluded to in the Gathas, and then, of course, when you get into the greater Zoroastrian tradition, whichever one you want to look at, whether it be textual or not textual, there are a lot of gods. A lot of gods. So many that I definitely couldn't list them all, and I certainly couldn't pronounce all their names because there are different languages. But the important part here to take away, if you're interested in the topic of, like, is Zoroastrianism monotheistic? Well, I have a video literally titled that, so you could scope that out. But what I wanted to address in this video, that's just my preface, by the way, was a viewer comment that I thought was extremely interesting, only because these are the types of questions I like because it helps flesh out my own perspective. I keep it purposefully vague because, well, one, content. If you got questions, I can make videos about it. But two, I like to keep a sort of non-dogmatic open hand to things, and that's how I'm going to approach this question today. But anyways, on the one front, the viewer asked specifically, did I think, given my own religious perspective is influenced by various different schools of thought, for instance, obviously Zoroastrianism, but also Mesopotamian paganism or polytheism, do I think within my own sort of cosmological model that Ahura Mazda, the sort of all-embodying creator god, the good god of Zoroastrianism, created the Mesopotamian gods, right? Now, this is not an outlandish question. I engage on the regular with Eastern Orthodox bros who were like converts to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, who buy into a type of Michael Heiser-ish divine council theory, who thinks that Yahweh was the creator of all these various gods of different cultures and communities. They actually do think all these gods exist, but there's something like monolatriist, meaning they only worship Yahweh, but they believe all these other gods exist, but they're not worthy of worship. That's very important. But that these are gods that kind of fell away, right? They're in rebellion against Yahweh. And I actually like that perspective because it's something that I can build off of. Because I agree, except minus that rebellion bit. I actually think that the gods, right? And you're like, well, which gods? All of them, right? Any culture's deities can and could be creations of Ahura Mazda. And let me try to flesh out what I mean by that. Because obviously I don't know every culture, every myth, every story, every theology of every deity out there. But I have said in the past that I think that Zoroastrianism might be the absolute best facilitator intellectually for paganism, polytheism. And what I mean is that if you view the reforms of Zarathustra as primarily cosmological and ethical, and various maybe other pieces there too philosophically, but that's we'll leave it for now. There is absolutely no problem with seeing that as a sort of backbinding philosophy to one's paganism or polytheism. And at least throughout history, Zoroastrianism has been excellent at facilitating other beliefs or syncretizing with other beliefs because it definitely did a lot. Now, on that note, do I think that Ahura Mazda created the Mesopotamian gods? Well, yes. And my own perspective, and I don't buy into a particular cosmological model. I try to keep it, again, very, very generalized. Like, did God create the world? Sure. Right. How did he do it? I mean, I could offer theories, but we don't really know. And I think that having a dogmatic perspective on that gets it gets damning after a while. Like, you're just digging yourself a hole. We don't know, right? We have different perspectives offered throughout history. the Sumerian world, the Babylonian world, the Assyrian world, and of course, yes, the Persian world. There are various different tellings of how this happened, some more or less mythical or scientific. And I think that they can tell us things about what those people thought. And I think that they can maybe even tell us things theologically about the gods involved. But I don't think that it has to be some rigid dogmatism to tell us, like, say, young earth creationists when it comes to the book of Genesis, that God or the gods literally did it this way. I think what's important, at least from, say, Zarathustra's perspective, is that metaphysically, two primordial principles have always existed, good and bad, and that is sort of the underpinning of everything going on, and everything kind of flows out from that. Uh, but I do think that Ahura Mazda is the creator of all the gods, like all beings worthy of worship. And I think that that would be best facilitated in what's called the sort of Yazada theology or Yazada system, to sort of borrow some language from Almond Hentz, a Zoroastrian scholar. And while I might disagree with her about, say, things on monotheism, I think she, at least in one of her papers, discussed very succinctly, and if I can remember, sometimes I do, I'll post that paper in the link below. I know, or in the description below. I've done that before for, I think, that paper in the past. Maybe I'll remember again. But she's got a really good paper called Monotheism, the Zoroastrian Way. And I think she goes to great lengths to detail like how efficient the Yazada system was at sort of syncretizing cultural deities from different people groups as Zoroastrianism sort of spread throughout the land. It wasn't that, oh, we just have to nix and get rid of these gods. Well, no, these gods just now become Yazada, right? And these are not archangels. I know I see that crap all the time on the internet. That is very Abrahamic language. These are beings worthy of worship. We need to be clear, right? Most Christians would not say that they're worshiping the angels, right? That they're not, I mean, maybe some of them would, but these are divine beings, right? These are very much akin to the gods of old, right? Most of them are actually the gods of old. They've just been brought into Zoroastrianism. And I would even say they're not even being demoted. I think in some capacity, becoming a Yazada would be like a promotion. It's theologically beyond what, say, the gods of old were oftentimes described as being, right? And so I think particularly to this one commenter, I think he asked about Marduk, and I suggested I don't see any problem with, say, in the theological worldview of, say, like the ancient Mesopotamians, why it would be a problem to say that Ahura Mazda created Marduk. Marduk, in his own myths, is a created god, birthed from higher gods. And it seems like once we get to, say, gods like Marduk in these sort of Babylonian periods, um, we already have differentiating genealogies of these gods coming into being and being born, their parentage, uh, and and it almost seems as if the entire, say, Enuma Elish is suggesting that Marduk is, well, stronger than his parentage. He's an even greater god, and he's one that came along later. And I also would point to, say, like certain academic texts on like the Sumerian god An, or Anu and later iterations. There's definitely some data to suggest like a fire cult later developed around the god An or Anu, which was sort of like the highest god at one point. Some myths have him being created by a primordial goddess, Namu, I believe. Um, but even in those capacities, scholars are willing to admit that it seems like ancient Mesopotamian people were just, uh, in a sense, trying to conflate certain theological pieces attached to, say, like Zeus or Ahura Mazda to their already established cultural deity An or Anu. By the way, this whole concept of like syncretizing and developing your one's theology of God, it's not unique to all these pagan groups. This happens to Yahweh as well, by the way. Hellenization is coming. So um, yes, I do think that Ahura Mazda created all the gods, and the language that I've used in the past, at least from my own perspective, right? Um, I think that there is a recognition that there must be, at least logically, a highest God that created the succession of gods and goddesses. Especially if you think, or if you buy into certain mythological tellings where these gods did kind of come into being at one point. Um, uh, I grant that there might be some difficulty if the gods always existed, or if that's a belief that you carry. But I would even point to, like, say, I know I said Parsis are the unique monotheists, but even they over in India have like pictures of like Hindu gods on their altars right beside pictures of like Zarathustra and their sacred fires. And so it is well within the Zoroastrian mindset that these other gods, unlike other religions, can be considered um, within the system. Like they can be facilitated within the system, and there's no reason to give them up. And that's why I oftentimes try to point my pagan pals, in that direction. I think that that might offer some potential further coherency. Not that they have to, right? I mean, certainly do what you want. But that is my perspective, and I think that if I'm using this language correctly, I haven't used Christian theology in this capacity in quite some time, but I think that there's nothing wrong with seeing, say, like from my perspective, Ahura Mazda is ontologically superior than to all the other gods because he is sort of the creator and facilitator of all the Yazada, right? He creates all the gods because he's sort of the primordial. Well, he is this primordial um, embodiment of good that's always existed. Um, but also, say for one's familial patron deity, like whoever that might be for you. Obviously, I've talked about this in my channel before, but for my family, it's Inanna or Ishtar. There's that Mesopotamian piece for those who are wondering and never seen my videos. Um, uh, that he can still be. I guess I could use the word economically. I want to use the word economically because of the Trinitarian language of Christianity. I feel like that's handy. Christianity has got a large Greco-Roman philosophical history, so it's very helpful to use that language. But ontologically superior, but your own patron deity might be like economically um, equal to in some capacity. And I oftentimes think about, from my own expression, and this is sort of to dovetail off of that conversation onto another viewer's question. In relation, the gods in relation to each other. I once had the question about um, how involved or interested am I in, say, like particular Parsi or cultural expressions of Zoroastrianism, say in India or even here in the United States, in which I responded that um, while I appreciate our Parsi Zoroastrians, I don't feel that they have their theology or their beliefs or even their expressions of the religion have any real binding or authority on how I practice. I see myself quite uniquely separate from that. Um, and what I mean is that, and this is how I expressed it to them too. I'm actually far more interested in looking at, say, Kurdish expressions of Zoroastrianism, especially how organically that's developing and how they've basically um, organized their own movement and thing. They're independent of like Parsi authority. Um, and for myself, specifically, at least throughout history, I'm very interested in the Zoroastrian expressions of, say, like Sogdiana or the Kushan Empire, right? Like I want to know more about that. That's the area of Zoroastrian history I think that is the most influential on me. And of course, as I've mentioned in the past, that's because of how they syncretized Mesopotamian and Zoroastrian gods. Um, and even with, say, those cultural expressions, you do see the elevation of the god Nana, the goddess Nana, who's, for all intents and purposes, a later iteration of Inanna or Ishtar, definitely influenced by the cult thereof, but probably a direct relation to the Mesopotamian goddess, um, uh, superseding Ahura Mazda. On certain ancient inscriptions, she comes first, and Ahura Mazda comes like third or fourth in line. And so, in that capacity, she was seen as like a top tier god. And so, I think that it would be fitting to say that maybe, at least in my own perspective, this obviously doesn't have to have any implication on yourself or anyone who watches this who's interested in Zoroastrianism or paganism or whatever, because we can disagree. That's okay, and there's no problem there. Um, Ahura Mazda is ontologically superior to all the other gods, but I'm going to use the word economically. I'm probably going to look back at that word and think, maybe I shouldn't have used economically. Maybe I could have just used a different term there. But um, how we relate to a particular god might put them on equal or superior grounds to Ahura Mazda. Even though we know, theologically speaking, Ahura Mazda is the top dog. He's the creator god. Um, boy, I'm anticipating this video getting me in all kinds of trouble. But I don't care. So that's how I would respond to those two particular questions. I'm extremely interested to see what people think about that. I mean, I've kind of fleshed this stuff out a little bit, but maybe not to that degree. Um, but I would be willing to. I mean, I am on the cusp of this now. I've got several academic texts coming in right now on Anglo-Saxon paganism and like Celtic paganism. I want to learn more about that. I mean, that's my entire cultural heritage. Somebody did 23andMe, um, and I want to know more about the stories, the myths, the gods. I think there's something there, and I think that obviously those ethnic traditions participated in something very similar and probably historically related to Zoroastrianism. And I want to see, what's there. I'm interested in it. And so I think that Zoroastrianism, again, um, best adequately facilitates pagan and polytheistic beliefs. Um, and that's why, I think that there's no problem even quasi proselytizing Zoroastrianism without trying to coerce people who are more interested in, say, more free expressions of polytheism, paganism, whatever sort of spirituality, without trying to limit them, right? We're merely offering an intellectual coherency, if anything. So tell me what you think. I'll look forward to the comments on this one.